I never thought that the first person to cause me endless sleepless nights would be my own older brother. If someone had asked me back then who I trusted the most in my life, I would not have hesitated to answer: my family. I grew up with a very American belief that family is the final safe place, the place where no one crosses each other's boundaries, no matter what happens outside. And I lived with that belief for nearly 40 years of my life. My name is Sawyer West. I live in Portland, Oregon. A city where it rains often, life moves slowly, and it feels quiet enough that people believe major tragedies won't happen here. I have a stable job in the logistics industry in downtown Portland, a small house in Beaverton, and a marriage I once believed was solid. I am not wealthy, but I have never lacked anything. I believed I was living an ordinary life, and I was satisfied with that. My wife is Emily West. She is not a loud person. Emily is reserved, thoughtful, and tends to keep her emotions to herself. We have been married for 6 years. 6 years is not a long time, but it was enough for me to believe I understood who she was. I believed that if something was wrong, Emily would tell me. That was how I viewed marriage. Not perfect, but honest. And then there was Lucas West, my brother, 3 years older than me. Lucas was someone I admired when I was younger. He was the kind of person the entire family relied on. Mature, calm, and always appearing to be the reasonable one. When I introduced Emily to my family, Lucas was the first person who made her feel comfortable. I was proud of that. I thought that at least the woman I loved was being welcomed safely into this family. Lucas often came over to our house. Not too frequently, but enough to become a familiar part of our weekly routine. Sometimes it was a simple dinner, sometimes just a late afternoon coffee. I never thought it was strange. On the contrary, it reassured me. I worked a lot, sometimes came home late, and in my mind, Emily having a family member to talk to and share things with was a good thing. During those days, I never questioned anything, not once. I did not check my wife's phone. I did not pay attention to her expressions or her eyes when she was texting. I did not look at message histories. I did not suspect anything. To me, doubting my family felt almost like an insult to myself. But there are things that exist even when you don't name them. There are feelings that are very small, very faint, like a cold breeze brushing your back when you least expect it. I remember one evening when Lucas had just left. Emily was in the kitchen cleaning up, and I was sitting in the living room. Everything looked completely normal. But in that moment, I suddenly realized I felt empty in a very strange way. Not sad, not angry, just out of sync. I said nothing. I told myself it was just exhaustion. Work had been stressful at the time. I was lacking sleep. I gave myself dozens of reasonable explanations. Men my age often do that. We are taught to be rational, to control our emotions, and not to overthink things. If I am honest with myself, even back then, a part of me already felt like I was standing outside of something. Not betrayed. Not yet. Just quietly left behind. But I didn't name it. I didn't want to break the image of a safe family that I had built in my mind for so many years. I continued living as usual, going to work, coming home, eating dinner with my wife, greeting my brother normally. I didn't know that this very normalcy was unintentionally allowing things to drift further away. I didn't know that boundaries, when not protected, slowly fade without making a sound. If someone had told me at that time that family could also become a threat, I would have laughed. But the truth is, sometimes the most dangerous things don't come from strangers. They come from the people you never thought you needed to be cautious about. And that was when my story truly began. The first moment that caught my attention did not come from a big secret, but from something very small. So small that if I told the story, many people would say I was overthinking. But small changes, when repeated long enough, force you to look straight at them. For me, it was Emily's smile when she was texting. I noticed it on an ordinary evening. I came home later than usual after work in downtown Portland. It was drizzling, as always. Emily was sitting on the sofa, the warm light casting onto her face. When I walked in, she didn't flinch or rush to put her phone away. But she smiled. A very faint, very private smile. And it disappeared the moment she realized I was looking. I didn't ask. I didn't want to become the kind of man who questions his wife over a smile. But from that moment on, I started paying attention. Not because of suspicion, but because of instinct. There was something about that smile that wasn't meant for me. I didn't know why I thought that, but the feeling stayed with me the entire evening. In the days that followed, I noticed Emily holding her phone more often. Not in a social media addicted way. She was texting with intention. Sometimes during dinner, she would place her phone face down on the table, as if she didn't want to be disturbed. Other times, when I was sitting right next to her, the screen would light up, and I would briefly see lines of text longer than the messages she sent to me. Our messages to each other at that time were very short. When are you coming home? Around what time? I'll eat first. Nothing was wrong, nothing was cold, but something was missing. Meanwhile, the messages I accidentally saw on Emily's screen had a different length. They weren't one sentence. They were paragraphs. I couldn't read the content, but I could see the effort. I began to wonder, very cautiously, what Emily was sharing with someone else. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't angry. I just felt like I was being left out of an important conversation in my wife's life. And that feeling, for a husband, was more frightening than physical betrayal. I remember another evening when I was watching the news in the living room while Emily was in the kitchen. I heard the soft vibration of her phone. Not once, many times. A steady rhythm, as if two people were going back and forth quickly. When Emily walked past the living room, she held the phone close to her body and instinctively tilted the screen away. That was the first time I felt like I shouldn't look, even though I had never had a habit of snooping. I still didn't ask. I told myself I was tired. I was afraid that if I spoke up, I would break something that might not even exist. I didn't want to become a suspicious husband, scrutinizing every small action. I grew up in a family where people believed that silence was sometimes the best way to preserve harmony. But silence has its price. The quieter I became, the more I observed. I realized Emily had started to compare. She didn't say it out loud, but the way she responded to me had changed. When I talked about a tiring day at work, she listened, but her eyes were no longer as focused as before. When I stayed quiet, she didn't ask. Instead, she reached for her phone. There is one moment I remember very clearly. One evening, I texted Emily while I was working late at the office. I said I was tired and might come home late. Her reply came nearly 10 minutes later, just one short sentence. But at that exact moment, my phone showed a notification. Emily had just sent multiple messages in a row to someone else. I didn't know who it was, but I knew it wasn't me. At that time, I still hadn't thought about my brother. Lucas's name hadn't appeared in my mind yet. I still believed that the most basic boundaries within a family were not something you had to question. I thought that if there was a problem, it would come from outside, not from the people closest to me. But the feeling of being left out became clearer and clearer. It wasn't loud. It didn't explode. It was quiet, like a small crack in a wall. You can live with it for a while, but you know that wall is no longer intact. I began to realize that what bothered me wasn't Emily texting, but the fact that she chose to text someone else instead of me when it came to emotional things. Our marriage hadn't collapsed. We still had dinner together. We still slept in the same bed. But an invisible distance was forming, and I didn't know whether I should step into it or stay where I was. I wondered if things would fix themselves if I stayed silent. I used to believe that. I used to believe that small issues would disappear if they weren't given attention. But deep down, I knew that some things, once they start drifting away, won't stop just because you close your eyes. And that was when I understood that those messages were no longer harmless. They were the first sign that I was slowly being excluded from the emotional world of my own wife. I still didn't know who was on the other end, but I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face that name. The name appeared in a way I was completely unprepared for. Not during a confrontation, not through a confession, but through a very ordinary, very accidental moment. A moment brief enough that you could pretend you hadn't seen anything, yet clear enough that you knew everything had entered a different phase. It was a weekend morning. Emily and I went out for coffee at Stumptown, our regular spot in Portland. The weather was cool, the rain had stopped, and the city looked gentle, as if nothing bad could happen here. Emily stood in line to order, and I stood next to her. When it was time to pay, she rummaged through her bag and said her phone was about to run out of battery, asking if she could use mine to scan the code. I handed it to her without thinking. While we waited for our drinks, Emily was holding my phone, and her phone was left on the counter. The screen lit up with a new message. I had no intention of looking. I swear I didn't. But the light turned on right in front of me, and by reflex, I glanced over. Just 1 second. Just long enough to read the sender's name. Lucas. I froze. Not in a dramatic, shocked way, but because my brain needed a few seconds to connect the information. Lucas. My brother. The name I had never placed on any list of threats. In that moment, I wanted to believe I had misread it. I wanted to believe it was just a meaningless coincidence. But a name cannot be mistaken. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't open the message. I didn't ask Emily. I stood still, as if by not moving, time would stop and give me a few extra seconds to understand what was happening. When Emily came back, she picked up her phone and very quickly, very naturally, turned the screen face down. The motion was so subtle that if I hadn't already been paying attention, I would have missed it. But now, I couldn't ignore it. We sat down at a table. Emily talked about something I no longer remember clearly. I nodded and responded out of habit. In my head, there was only one question repeating over and over. Why my brother? Not a stranger, not a coworker, but Lucas, the person who grew up with me, the person who once protected me, the person I believed would never put himself in this position. I began to recall details I had previously ignored. The way Lucas asked about Emily more than necessary. The way he remembered small things about her that I didn't. The way Emily comfortably shared personal matters when Lucas was around. The scattered pieces suddenly fit together, and the picture they formed sent a chill through me. After we got home, I said nothing. I couldn't. I needed time to understand what I was feeling. Anger? Yes. Pain? A lot. But above all, confusion. I didn't know what I was facing. This didn't resemble an affair in the way people usually describe it. There was no physical evidence, no confession, just a name on a screen, and a heavy feeling in my chest. That evening, Emily went into the bathroom and left her phone on the table. I looked at it. I knew I was standing at another boundary. If I picked it up, I would never be able to return to who I was before. I stood there for a long time. In the end, I didn't open it. But I was no longer naive. I had seen enough to know that conversations were happening that I was not part of. In the days that followed, I noticed Lucas texting Emily even when there was no specific family-related reason. Not general check-ins, personal questions. I didn't read the content, but I saw the frequency. I saw the timing. I saw the priority. And I understood that a private space existed between them, a space from which I was excluded. What hurt me most wasn't the intimacy. It was the familiarity. They talked to each other like two people who understood each other's inner worlds. Like two people sharing an emotional language I was no longer allowed to speak. I began to wonder if, during the moments I thought Emily was being quiet, she was actually talking to Lucas. I still hadn't confronted them. I hadn't made a scene. I continued going to work, eating dinner with my wife, replying to my brother's messages. But everything had changed. I no longer looked at them the same way. Every interaction carried a layer of suspicion I couldn't shake. For the first time in my life, I understood the feeling of being betrayed without clear evidence. A betrayal that didn't require physical contact, didn't require broken vows, only the crossing of a boundary no one should have been allowed to cross. And the most frightening part was that I didn't know when that boundary had first been crossed. I knew I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't seen anything. Lucas's name on Emily's phone screen had closed the last door of innocence inside me. From that moment on, I understood that sooner or later, I would have to force them to name what was happening, no matter how high the cost would be. After that morning at the coffee shop, I entered a very strange phase of my marriage. There were no arguments, no tears. Everything continued to function normally, almost frighteningly so. Emily still cooked dinner. I still went to work and came home on time. Lucas still texted to check on me as if nothing had changed. But inside me, an invisible wall had been built, and I knew I could never return to my previous state. I began observing everything from a new distance. Not to look for evidence, but to understand the nature of what was happening. I wanted to know how far the boundary had been crossed, and whether I was exaggerating things in my own mind. I didn't want to accuse anyone based solely on emotion. But the more I observed, the more I realized that what was happening was no longer harmless concern between family members. The conversations between Emily and me grew shorter, not because of anger, but because she seemed to have grown accustomed to sharing her emotions elsewhere. When I asked if she was tired, she answered, "I'm fine." When I asked how her day had been, she said, "Normal." No details, no elaboration. The things we used to talk about quietly disappeared. Meanwhile, Lucas knew more than I thought. He knew what Emily was worried about. He knew she hadn't been sleeping well for several nights. He knew small things that I should have been the first to hear. I didn't ask Lucas how he knew. I already knew the answer, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it spoken aloud. One evening, Lucas came by our house, just a short visit. Emily made tea. I sat across from him. No one mentioned the messages. No one brought up anything unusual. But the atmosphere was different. I noticed the way Emily looked at Lucas when he spoke. Not the look of a sister-in-law, but the look of someone who felt heard. I began to understand that what hurt me most wasn't the content of the messages, but the position Lucas had taken in my wife's emotional life. He didn't intrude into our marriage through obvious actions. He slipped in through presence, through concern, through being there at moments when I was no longer there in the way Emily needed. I asked myself whether I bore some responsibility in this. I didn't deny that I had been busy. I had thought that providing a stable life was enough. I had believed that marriage could survive on trust and routine alone. But those questions didn't erase a simple truth. No matter how imperfect I was, the boundary between my wife and my brother was never supposed to be crossed. That evening, I finally spoke up. Not in anger, not loudly. I simply said that I knew. I said that I felt excluded. Emily stayed silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, the first thing she said wasn't an apology. She said I was overthinking. That there was nothing wrong between her and Lucas. That they were just talking like family. Lucas didn't say much. He looked down. His silence said more than any excuse could. If everything were truly innocent, why could neither of them look me in the eye and say it clearly? I didn't ask that question out loud. I didn't need to. I could feel the answer in the heavy air of the room. I told them that betrayal doesn't always begin with physical contact. Sometimes it begins with sharing things that should belong to your partner with someone else. I said that what hurt me wasn't that they talked, but that they chose each other to talk about things that I was excluded from. Emily responded defensively. She said she needed to be understood. That Lucas listened to her, that I wasn't present in the way she wanted. I listened to everything. I didn't deny her feelings, but I also didn't accept using emotional needs as a justification to cross an ethical boundary. The conversation ended without a clear conclusion. No one left. No one hugged. No one apologized in the way I had hoped. But something had changed forever. Things that had been covered by silence were now exposed. And once you have seen them, you can't pretend you never did. That night, I lay beside Emily, but the distance between us had never felt so vast. I stared at the ceiling and understood that my marriage was standing at a crossroads. I didn't yet know which direction I would take, but I knew one thing for certain. From this moment on, I could no longer accept a relationship in which I had to compete with my own brother for my wife's emotional presence. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm clock, but because a heavy feeling pulled me out of sleep. Emily was still lying beside me, breathing evenly, as if the conversation that had shaken our marriage the night before had never happened. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft rain tapping against the window, and realized that for the first time in many years, I didn't know what I was waking up for. I quietly got out of bed, put on my jacket, and drove out while the city hadn't fully awakened yet. Early morning Portland has a very particular stillness. I drove across the bridge over the Willamette River, watching the gray water flow slowly beneath me. In my mind, the questions were no longer about who was right or wrong, but about one single thing: where my boundary was in this marriage. I realized that for many years I had lived under the assumption that boundaries were obvious, something that didn't need to be spoken. I believed there were things everyone simply understood. But when boundaries are not named, they become the easiest things to violate. I hadn't clearly expressed what I needed, and I also hadn't recognized when those needs were being ignored. When I returned home, Emily was awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee, her eyes tired. The air between us was heavy, but no longer vague like before. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. If I stayed silent any longer, I would lose myself in this marriage. I told Emily that I needed to reset boundaries. I said that I couldn't accept her sharing intimate, emotional matters with Lucas. I didn't accuse. I didn't blame. I only spoke about how I felt. That I felt excluded. That I felt my place in my wife's emotional life was being replaced. Emily looked at me for a long time. She said she hadn't intended to betray me. That she was only seeking someone who would listen. I didn't deny that. But I told her that intention doesn't change impact. Whether intentional or not, the boundary had been crossed, and I was the one who had to live with that feeling every day. I made it clear that from this point on, I needed transparency. I needed to know that the private matters of our marriage would remain within our marriage. I wasn't asking her to cut off her family. I was asking for respect. I said that if this boundary wasn't respected, I wouldn't be able to keep pretending that everything was fine. The conversation wasn't easy. Emily became defensive, then quiet. I didn't expect an apology right away. I only needed her to understand that I was serious, that this wasn't baseless jealousy, but an issue of values and emotional safety. That afternoon, I texted Lucas. The message was brief. I said that I needed to talk to him. Not to argue, but to clarify boundaries. Lucas replied after a while, saying that he understood. Just 2 words. But to me, they carried a weight that was hard to describe. When I met Lucas, no one else was there. Not Emily, not family, just the 2 of us. I told him that I felt betrayed. Not because of physical actions, but because of the emotional intimacy he had allowed. I said that regardless of his intentions, becoming a substitute for my emotional role in my marriage was unacceptable. Lucas lowered his head. He apologized. He said he hadn't thought things had gone that far. I listened, but I also told him that no one accidentally crosses a boundary without permission, even if that permission comes in the form of silence. I said that from now on, our relationship needed clear distance. When I left that meeting, I didn't feel relieved. I only felt clearer. Clearer about what I could accept and what I couldn't. Clearer about the fact that I was no longer willing to sacrifice my self-respect to maintain an outward image of a peaceful family. That evening I returned home and sat alone in the living room. Emily was in the bedroom. No one said anything else, but I knew that something important had changed. I had spoken my boundary, and no matter where the future led, I knew that from this moment on, I was no longer standing still in my own story. The 3-person conversation happened on an unplanned evening. I didn't create a detailed plan, and I didn't prepare my words in advance. I only knew that if it continued to drag on, everything would slip into a different kind of harm, one that was more festering and harder to heal. I asked both Emily and Lucas to sit down in the living room. No television, no phones, nothing to hide behind. As they sat across from me, I realized something very clearly. None of us could pretend to be innocent anymore. Not because there was a clear accusation, but because the silence between the 3 of us had taken the shape of truth. I began by saying that I didn't want to argue. I said that I wanted clarity. I wanted things to be called by their proper names. Emily reacted first. She said that I was making everything more serious than necessary, that there was nothing between her and Lucas that crossed any boundaries, that they were just harmless conversations. I listened, but I didn't argue right away. I let those words exist in the space for a moment, like a test. I asked Emily a very simple question. If those conversations were truly harmless, why had she never told me about them? Why did I have to discover them through fragmented moments, through the feeling of being excluded, instead of hearing about them directly from my wife? Emily didn't answer immediately. Her silence stretched on, and in that pause, I realized my question had hit its mark. Lucas sat there with his hands clasped together. He didn't look at me. I turned to him and asked whether he thought it was appropriate to become the person my wife turned to for private emotional sharing. Lucas said he only wanted to help, that he had no other intentions. I didn't deny his goodwill, but I said that good intentions could not justify occupying the wrong position. I said that I didn't blame them for talking. I blamed the way they talked, in a way that pushed me out. I said that when a wife chooses to share her deepest worries with another man, especially her husband's brother, it is no longer a small matter. It is an intrusion into a space that should belong to the marriage. Emily began to cry, not out of guilt, but out of pressure. She said she had felt lonely, that I was no longer there in the way she needed. I didn't deny that feeling. I said I was willing to take responsibility for the parts where I had fallen short. But I also said that loneliness does not grant anyone the right to break another person's boundaries. The conversation grew heavy. No one raised their voice. No one walked out. But every sentence carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. I realized that we weren't just talking about messages. We were talking about how each of us defined right and wrong, intimacy and loyalty. I told Lucas that from now on he needed to step back. Not because I hated him, but because the relationship between Emily and me needed space to confront what was happening on its own. I said that if he truly respected me, he would understand that. Lucas nodded. He didn't offer further justification. The conversation ended not with reconciliation, but with acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that things had gone too far to be considered harmless. An acknowledgement that boundaries had blurred, even if no one had intentionally named it from the beginning. I didn't leave the room feeling victorious. I left with a sense of exhaustion, but also honesty. That night, Emily and I slept in the same bed, but we didn't touch each other. I was acutely aware of her presence, and at the same time, the distance between us. I understood that clarity doesn't always bring immediate relief. It only opens a new path, one where you are forced to face harder questions. Before falling asleep, I thought about my family, about the values I once believed were unchanging. I realized that not all values exist on their own. They need to be protected, spoken aloud, and sometimes paid for. The conversation tonight didn't solve everything, but it ended the ambiguity. And for me, that was the necessary next step, no matter how painful it was. After the conversation that night, everything didn't collapse immediately. There was no scene of someone grabbing a suitcase and leaving in the middle of the night. There were no dramatic goodbyes. Instead, there was a prolonged silence, heavy and exhausting, as if the entire house was holding its breath. I realized that sometimes the most uncomfortable thing isn't conflict, but its prolonged existence. In the days that followed, Emily tried to behave normally. She asked if I would be home for dinner. She asked if I needed anything from the store. Familiar questions, appropriate for a wife. But one thing was no longer the same: spontaneity. Every word was weighed. Every gesture was cautious. We lived next to each other, but we no longer lived together in an emotional sense. Lucas kept his distance exactly as promised. He didn't come over. He didn't text Emily privately. When family matters needed to be discussed, he messaged in the group chat. I noticed the change immediately. It proved that what I had felt before wasn't imaginary. If boundaries could be rebuilt that quickly, then clearly they had been erased before. Even so, Lucas's change didn't bring me the relief I had expected. I didn't feel victorious. I only felt empty. I realized that the biggest issue was no longer my brother, but my marriage. The messages were only symptoms. The real illness was the distance that had formed between Emily and me long before. One evening I stayed late at the office. Outside the window, Portland was dark and wet. Streetlights reflected on the pavement, forming long streaks of light. I sat alone, staring at the computer screen that was turned off, and for the first time allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding. Without Lucas, was this marriage truly okay? I remembered the early years of our relationship. The conversations that lasted without needing a reason. The evenings when simply sitting next to each other felt like enough. I wondered when we had begun replacing presence with convenience. When I had started believing that physical presence was enough, without emotional presence. When I came home that night, Emily was still awake. She was sitting on the bed, her back against the headboard, as if she had been waiting for me. The atmosphere wasn't as tense as before, but it wasn't warm either. She said she wasn't sure if we could go back to how things were. Not because of Lucas, but because of what had been exposed between us. For the first time, Emily admitted that she had sought understanding from Lucas because she felt I was no longer listening to her. She didn't say it to place blame, but as a belated truth. I listened, and this time, I didn't argue. I realized that some truths don't make you feel better, but you need to hear them so you don't keep living in an illusion. We talked for a long time that night. No raised voices, no defensiveness. Just two people trying to understand where they had lost each other. But the more we talked, the more I realized that the damage ran deeper than I had thought. Trust wasn't just cracked because of Lucas, but because of the feeling that I was no longer the first place Emily turned to when she needed to be heard. I understood that not everything can be saved through effort. Some distances, once formed, don't disappear just because you acknowledge them. I didn't state my decision right then, but inside me, one thing became very clear. Staying out of endurance is not a way to repair a relationship. A few days later, I decided to leave the house for a while. Not to punish Emily, not to create pressure. I just needed space to hear myself again. I packed a few clothes, some personal items, and rented a small apartment near downtown. Emily didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she had already prepared herself for it. When I closed the door of the new apartment on the first night, I sat down on the floor, leaned my back against the wall, and took a deep breath. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel hopeless either. I just felt tired. But it was an honest exhaustion, no longer covered by denial. I understood that leaving wasn't the end, but it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that some relationships cannot be healed simply by staying. And sometimes, the only way not to completely lose yourself is to step away from the place that was once called home. The days of living alone gave me more time to think, but they also forced me to face thoughts I had always avoided before. The small apartment near downtown Portland wasn't anything special. Simple furniture, white walls, a window looking out onto a rain-soaked street. But it was precisely that emptiness that allowed me to hear my own voice more clearly. At first I thought I would feel relieved, that leaving the old house would free me from the feeling of betrayal. But emotions don't work in such a neat way. There were mornings when I woke up with a rare sense of peace. But there were also evenings when the city lights came on, and I felt a deep kind of emptiness. Not because I missed Emily, but because I was saying goodbye to a version of myself. I began to look back at the entire story, not to assign more blame, but to understand what I had learned. I realized that betrayal doesn't always appear in the form people usually warn you about. It doesn't always begin with obvious lies or secret meetings. Sometimes, it starts with too much comfort, with sharing emotions in the wrong place, with allowing someone else to step into a space that should have been protected. I also realized that I had once equated silence with maturity. I believed that not speaking up was a way to preserve harmony. But in reality, there are things that, if not spoken early, will find their own way to grow into something more dangerous. Boundaries do not exist on their own. They need to be established, repeated, and protected, even with the people you love the most. Emily and I stayed in contact. Not frequently, not coldly. We spoke like two people learning how to respect a new distance. No more arguments, no more justifications. Just an acknowledgement that there were wounds we couldn't yet touch, and perhaps it wasn't time to touch them. I didn't resent her, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my emotional safety to hold on to a relationship that had changed. As for Lucas, I didn't cut him off completely, but our relationship had changed. Fewer words, less closeness. No more private conversations like before. I didn't see it as a loss, but as a necessary adjustment. Some relationships can only exist in a healthy way when they are placed in the right position. One evening I stood by the apartment window, watching the slow-moving traffic below in the rain. I suddenly understood that if I had continued staying in that marriage out of endurance, I would gradually lose my ability to trust my own emotions. And once you begin to doubt your own feelings, you no longer know what you are living for. I don't know where the future of Emily and me will go, Maybe we will find a way to heal. Maybe we will choose different paths. But for the first time in a long while, I am not afraid of the answer. Because I know that whatever the outcome, I chose to be honest with myself. If there is one thing I want to say to those who find themselves in a similar situation, it is this. Don't wait until the pain becomes obvious before you start asking questions. If you feel yourself being gradually excluded from your partner's emotional world, that feeling is not unfounded. It is a signal. And that signal deserves to be heard. Family, marriage, or any relationship cannot exist on titles alone. They exist through presence, respect, and boundaries that are upheld every day. I once believed that family was an absolute safe place. Now I believe that safety doesn't come from who you trust, but from not abandoning yourself. On the last night before signing a long-term lease for the apartment, I lay on the bed, city lights reflecting onto the ceiling. I didn't know whether I was ending one chapter or beginning another. But I knew that this story, painful as it was, had taught me how to stand upright in my own life. And that is what I carry with me as I move forward.